September 19th, 1356. A hillside near Poitiers, France. The greatest army France had assembled in a generation. Over 20,000 men, including the flower of French nobility, and King Jean II himself, surrounded a battered English force of barely 6,000 exhausted, starving warriors who had been raiding across France for 2 months. The English were trapped, their backs to a river, their supplies exhausted, their horses dying, their escape routes cut off by an army more than 3 times their size. They had no chance. Victory was impossible. Survival seemed unlikely. Yet by sunset, the King of France would be a prisoner. Thousands of French nobles would lie dead in the fields, and an English prince barely 26 years old would achieve the most complete, most improbable, most strategically significant victory of the 100 Years' War. This is the story of the Battle of Poitiers, where Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, turned certain disaster into legendary triumph, where French chivalry charged to its destruction for the 3rd time in a generation, where a king was captured by a simple knight, where longbows and discipline defeated overwhelming numbers and aristocratic confidence, and where medieval France suffered a humiliation so profound that the kingdom nearly collapsed into chaos. This is how 6,000 Englishmen destroyed 20,000 Frenchmen and changed the course of European history. To understand the catastrophe at Poitiers, to comprehend how France managed to repeat the exact same mistakes that had led to disaster at Crécy 10 years earlier, we must first understand the man who led the English army and the campaign that brought both forces to this hillside battlefield. Edward of Woodstock, known to history as the Black Prince, though that nickname may not have been used during his lifetime, was 26 years old in September 1356, the eldest son of King Edward III of England and heir to the English throne. He had been born into warfare. His father had claimed the French throne through his mother, triggering the 100 Years' War that had already raged for nearly 2 decades. Edward had fought in his first major battle at Crécy in 1346 when he was just 16 years old, commanding the English vanguard in the victory that shattered French military confidence. For 10 years since Crécy, he had been learning the arts of war and command, fighting in raids across France, developing a reputation as a bold, aggressive, sometimes reckless commander who led from the front and inspired absolute loyalty in his men. He was tall, strong, skilled with weapons, and possessed of the warrior ethos that defined medieval nobility at its best, but he was also intelligent, capable of tactical thinking that went beyond simple courage, and willing to use any advantage, however ungentlemanly, to achieve victory. This combination of personal valor and tactical ruthlessness would prove decisive at Poitiers.
The campaign that led to Poitiers began in August 1356 when the Black Prince led a chevauchée, a destructive raid from English-controlled Gascony in southwestern France, northward toward the Loire Valley. A chevauchée was not a conquest attempt, but economic warfare, designed to burn crops, destroy villages, loot towns, and demonstrate that the French king could not protect his subjects. It was terrorism by medieval standards, calculated to undermine confidence in royal authority and enrich the raiders through plunder. The Black Prince's army had started with perhaps 8,000 men, English men-at-arms, Welsh and English longbowmen, Gascon allies, and mounted men who could move quickly across the French countryside. For 2 months, they had ravaged central France, burning their way north, looting everything of value, destroying what they could not carry. They had met almost no resistance because the French army was scattered, caught off guard by the speed and direction of the English advance. But the longer the raid continued, the more time the French had to mobilize. By mid-September, the Black Prince knew he was in danger. His army was exhausted from 2 months of constant marching and fighting. His supplies were running low, despite all the plunder they had taken. His horses were dying. Many men were now fighting on foot because their mounts had collapsed. And French forces were converging on him from multiple directions, cutting off his route back to Gascony. On September 17th, French scouts reported to King Jean II that the English army was nearby, moving slowly, heavily laden with plunder, vulnerable. Jean immediately mobilized his entire army for pursuit. This was the moment France had been waiting for since Crécy. The English had raided with impunity for too long. Now they were trapped far from their bases, exhausted, and could be brought to battle and destroyed. Jean II, King of France since 1350, was determined not to repeat the mistakes of Crécy, where his father Philip VI had allowed the English to choose their ground and deploy their devastating longbowmen in prepared positions. This time, the French would force battle immediately, use their overwhelming numerical superiority to crush the English before they could fortify a position, and prove that French chivalry was still the finest military force in Christendom. King Jean was brave, pious, and determined, qualities that made him a good man, but not necessarily a good general. He assembled an army of staggering size. Estimates vary, but contemporary sources suggest 20,000 to 30,000 men, though modern historians tend toward the lower estimate. Even accepting the conservative figure of 20,000, the French outnumbered the English more than 3 to 1. The French army included virtually every important noble in France. The king's 4 sons, including the Dauphin Charles, who would later rule France, were present. Dukes, counts, barons, and knights from across the kingdom had answered the summons. This was not just an army, but a gathering of the entire French military aristocracy, representing centuries of martial tradition and overwhelming confidence in their superiority over the English archers they dismissed as low-born peasants with sticks.
On September 18th, the French army caught up with the English near the town of Poitiers. The Black Prince, realizing he could not outrun the French with his exhausted force, began looking for a defensible position where he could fight with some hope of survival. He found it on a hillside north of Poitiers, near the village of Noyers-Maupertuis. The position was not ideal, but it was the best available. The English deployed on a ridge with their flanks protected by hedgerows, vineyards, and marshland that would impede cavalry charges. A sunken road ran along the front of the position, creating a natural obstacle. Behind the English position was the river Miasson, cutting off their retreat, but also preventing the French from outflanking them. It was a defensive position born of desperation, not choice. The English had their backs to a river, something military doctrine advised against, but they had no alternative. The Black Prince organized his forces carefully, using every advantage the terrain offered. He divided his small army into 3 divisions, or battles, as they were called. The vanguard was commanded by the Earls of Warwick and Suffolk, positioned on the right of the English line. The center was commanded by the Earl of Salisbury. The rear guard, which would actually fight in the center of the line, was commanded by the Black Prince himself. This was typical of the prince's style, commanding from the front, where he could see the battle and personally inspire his men. Critically, the Black Prince placed his longbowmen in positions where they could shoot from protected locations. Archers were positioned behind hedgerows and in the vineyard, where the vegetation provided cover while still allowing them to shoot at approaching enemies. Some archers were positioned to shoot along the flanks of any French advance, creating crossfire that would devastate cavalry charges. The sunken road in front of the English position created a natural obstacle that cavalry would have to navigate, slowing them and bunching them together into perfect targets. Most of the English knights and men-at-arms were dismounted, fighting on foot. This was standard English practice by 1356, learned from Crécy and earlier battles. English nobles had overcome their prejudice against fighting on foot and recognized that dismounted men-at-arms created a more stable defensive line and freed up horses that were in short supply. Only a small mounted reserve was kept, perhaps 200 to 300 cavalry under the Captal de Buch, a Gascon noble allied to England. This tiny cavalry force would play a crucial role later. On the evening of September 18th, the 2 armies camped within sight of each other. The French were confident, the English desperate. That night, the Black Prince sent negotiators to the French camp, attempting to arrange terms. He offered to return all plunder taken during the chevauchée, to surrender all prisoners captured,
to promise not to fight against France for 7 years, anything to be allowed to withdraw to Gascony without battle. These were humiliating terms, essentially admitting defeat and buying safe passage. But the Black Prince understood his situation was desperate enough to justify humiliation if it meant survival.
King John II refused the terms. He had the English trapped and saw no reason to let them escape. He demanded unconditional surrender, that the Black Prince and all his nobles present themselves as prisoners, which was unacceptable to English honor and probably would have resulted in enormous ransoms that would bankrupt English participants. The Black Prince rejected unconditional surrender, and both sides prepared for battle the next morning. That night, some English soldiers attempted to sneak away, deserting the army to save themselves. The Black Prince reportedly rode through the camp personally, rallying his men, threatening deserters with execution, promising that if they stood and fought, they had a chance, but if they tried to flee, they would be hunted down by French cavalry and killed anyway. It was not an inspiring speech promising easy victory, but a grim acknowledgement of reality. Fight or die. On the morning of September 19, 1356, the French army formed up in sight of the English position. What happened next, the sequence of French mistakes and English tactical responses, would be analyzed and debated for centuries. The first French error was organizational. Instead of attacking immediately with their overwhelming force, the French spent hours organizing their army into formal divisions and arranging the order of battle according to social precedents. Who would have the honor of fighting in the front rank? Which nobles would lead which divisions? These questions consumed hours while the English watched and continued improving their defensive positions. The French eventually organized into 4 main divisions. The vanguard was commanded by the Dauphin Charles, the king's eldest son and heir. The second division was commanded by the Duke of Orleans, the king's brother. The third division was commanded by the Duke of Bourbon. The king himself commanded the fourth and largest division at the rear. This organization looked impressive on paper, but created command and coordination problems. Each division was essentially independent, led by a prince or duke who was not accustomed to taking orders from anyone except the king. This made coordinated tactical maneuvers difficult. Additionally, the French made a critical decision about how to fight, influenced by their study of what had happened at Crécy. At Crécy in 1346, French cavalry charges had been slaughtered by English longbowmen. French horses had been shot down, throwing their riders, creating chaos. The French had learned that charging English archers on horseback was suicidal, but they learned the wrong lesson. Instead of concluding that charging prepared English positions was a bad idea, regardless of whether you were mounted or on foot, they concluded that the problem was specifically charging on horseback. Therefore, at Poitiers, most French knights would fight dismounted, advancing on foot against the English position. This was supposed to make them less vulnerable to arrows and create a more solid formation that could overwhelm the English through weight and discipline. It was a catastrophic misunderstanding of what had gone wrong at Crécy. The problem at Crécy had not been that French knights were mounted, but that they charged across open ground against prepared defensive positions held by longbowmen who could shoot 12 to 15 arrows per minute. Dismounting the knights did not solve this problem, it made it worse. Dismounted knights in 60 to 70 pounds of armor, marching uphill across rough ground toward prepared positions, would be even slower and more vulnerable than mounted cavalry, spending more time under arrow fire, becoming exhausted from the physical effort of moving in armor, and arriving at the English lines too tired to fight effectively. But French military thinking was dominated by concepts of honor and tradition. Knights were supposed to fight bravely, facing the enemy directly, trusting in God and their superior breeding to deliver victory. The idea of not attacking, of refusing battle, of using tactics that seemed cowardly was unthinkable for French nobility. They would attack because that's what knights did, and they would attack dismounted because that had been decided as the proper response to the lesson of Crécy. The French did keep one mounted force, a vanguard of 300 elite cavalry under the command of the marshals Clermont and Otterham. This force was intended to charge the English lines first, breaking through or at least disrupting the English formation before the dismounted knights arrived. It was a sound tactical concept, using cavalry to smash into defensive positions and create gaps for following infantry to exploit. The battle began around mid-morning when the French mounted vanguard, 300 heavily armored cavalry on armored horses, began their charge toward the English position. These were elite warriors, the finest heavy cavalry in France, knights who had trained for this their entire lives. They carried lances, wore full plate armor, and rode destriers, massive war horses bred for combat. They represented the pinnacle of medieval military technology and training, and they charged directly into the kill zone the Black Prince had prepared. As the French cavalry accelerated toward the English lines, the longbowmen opened fire. 2,000 to 3,000 English and Welsh archers, positioned in protected locations with prepared fields of fire, began loosing arrows at the rate of 12 to 15 per minute per archer. Within seconds, thousands of arrows were in the air, creating a cloud of projectiles that darkened the sky. The bodkin-pointed arrows, designed to penetrate armor, struck horses and knights with devastating effect. Horses, even those with armor, had vulnerable areas: eyes, mouths, legs, flanks. An arrow in the eye or mouth could drop a 1,500-pound horse instantly. Arrows hitting legs could shatter bones, crippling the horse. A charging horse wounded by arrows would rear, buck, or fall, throwing its rider and creating obstacles for following cavalry. The charge began to lose cohesion within seconds as horses fell or veered away from the arrow storm.
The few cavalry who made it through the arrow fire found themselves funneled by the terrain into the sunken road where they could only advance in a narrow column. No longer a charge, but a traffic jam of armored men on horseback, trying to climb out of a ditch while English men-at-arms stabbed at them with spears and axes. Marshal Clermont was killed in this initial assault. Marshal Otterham was captured. The cavalry charge, which should have smashed into the English line and disrupted their formation, was instead destroyed in minutes without achieving anything. The survivors retreated, many without their horses, joining the main French force that was preparing to advance on foot. The French dismounted knights now began their advance up the hill toward the English position. This was an impressive sight. Thousands of armored warriors advancing in disciplined ranks, the finest knights in Christendom, marching to battle on foot. They advanced slowly, not running, but walking to preserve energy, maintaining formation. They carried shortened lances or pole axes, weapons better suited to fighting on foot than long cavalry lances. They looked invincible, an iron wall advancing uphill. But they were advancing uphill, in armor, across rough ground, through vineyards and hedgerows, in late summer heat, and they were being shot at with every step. The English longbowmen continued their devastating work. Unlike the brief engagement with cavalry, the dismounted knights spent minutes under sustained arrow fire as they slowly advanced. Arrows fell in a continuous rain, striking armor with enough force to bruise or break bones, even when they did not penetrate. Arrows found gaps in armor, visors, joints, the spaces where plates met. Men fell with arrows through eye slits, through the armpit where armor was weakest, through the groin where plate gave way to mail. Those who were not hit were still affected. The psychological impact of being under sustained arrow fire, hearing arrows strike your armor and the armor of men around you, seeing your comrades fall, knowing any second an arrow might find a gap, was devastating. Men flinched, ducked, raised their arms to protect their faces, all of which disrupted the disciplined formation. The physical exhaustion was equally debilitating. Walking uphill in 60 to 70 pounds of armor and carrying weapons over rough ground, through vegetation, while being shot at is enormously draining. By the time the French knights reached the English line, many were exhausted, gasping for breath, their swings weak,
their formations ragged. The English men-at-arms, fighting from behind the sunken road and prepared positions, were fresh and ready. The first clash favored the English simply because the French attackers were exhausted from their approach. The battle along the sunken road became a grinding, brutal melee of armored men, hacking at each other with swords, axes, and polearms. This was medieval combat at its grimmest, not glorious charges or chivalric duels, but exhausting, terrifying, close-quarters fighting, where men in heavy armor tried to bash each other to death with metal implements.
The French had numerical superiority, but they could not bring all their numbers to bear simultaneously because the terrain funneled them into a relatively narrow front. The English position, compressed by terrain, meant they could concentrate their smaller force effectively. When French warriors broke through at one point, English reserves moved to plug the gap. When the French line seemed about to buckle from exhaustion, French reserves moved forward to relieve tired warriors. The battle settled into a stalemate of mutual exhaustion. Both sides were fighting with desperate intensity, but neither could break the other. This phase of the battle lasted for an hour, perhaps longer. Men on both sides collapsed from exhaustion. The ground became slippery with blood. The noise was deafening, metal striking metal, men screaming, officers shouting orders that could barely be heard over the chaos. Then the French made their second catastrophic error. The Duke of Orleans division, which should have been supporting the attack or waiting to exploit a breakthrough, instead withdrew from the battle. Sources disagree about why. Some suggest the Duke saw the attack faltering and decided retreat was prudent. Others suggest confusion in the French command structure. Whatever the reason, suddenly thousands of French warriors who should have been reinforcing the attack were leaving the battlefield, marching back toward Poitiers. This created panic among other French divisions. If the Duke's men were retreating, did that mean the battle was lost? Should they retreat too? The Dauphin's division, which had been fighting in the front line and taking heavy casualties, also began to pull back. This may have been a tactical withdrawal to regroup, or it may have been influenced by seeing other French forces leaving. Regardless of intent, the effect was that the main French assault on the English position suddenly collapsed. Thousands of French knights who had been pressing the attack were now retreating down the hill, leaving their comrades fighting at the English line unsupported. The English, seeing the French withdrawal, were stunned. For over an hour, they had been fighting desperately, holding on by their fingernails against overwhelming numbers, expecting at any moment to be overrun. Now suddenly the pressure was releasing. French warriors in hand-to-hand combat with English men-at-arms were being abandoned by their supporting ranks. The English began to push back, no longer simply defending, but advancing. French warriors at the front, now isolated and surrounded, were killed or captured in large numbers. But the battle was not over. King John II, commanding the French reserve, had not retreated. He now advanced with the final French division, perhaps 6,000 knights and men-at-arms, the last uncommitted French force. Jean was personally brave, and he was determined to salvage victory from the disaster unfolding before him. If his sons and brothers had failed or fled, he would succeed. He would lead from the front, rallying his men through personal example. The king's division advanced up the hill toward the English position, and for a moment it seemed possible they might break through. The English were exhausted from over an hour of desperate fighting, their lines ragged, many wounded, all physically drained. The Black Prince himself was fighting in the front rank, his armor dented and bloodied, personally killing or wounding French knights, visible to his men and inspiring them through his presence. But he recognized that his force could not withstand another sustained assault by fresh French troops. The English line was at the breaking point. If King Jean's division crashed into them in their current exhausted state, the English would likely collapse. The prince needed to do something dramatic to change the momentum. He ordered his tiny mounted reserve, perhaps 200-300 cavalry under the Captal de Buch, to circle around the French flank and attack from the side or rear. This was an enormous risk. The English could barely spare these men from the main line. If the flanking attack failed, the English would have weakened their defensive position for nothing. But the Black Prince understood that desperate situations required desperate measures. The Captal de Buch led his cavalry around the French flank, using the terrain and vegetation for cover, and emerged on the French left flank and rear just as King Jean's division was fully engaged with the English front line. The sudden appearance of English cavalry in their rear caused panic among the French. Medieval armies feared being surrounded above all else, and the cry went up,
"We are surrounded! They are behind us!" The psychological impact was devastating. French knights who had been advancing determinedly suddenly turned to face this new threat, disrupting their formation and their assault on the English position. The Black Prince, seeing the effect of the cavalry attack and the confusion in the French ranks, ordered a general advance. The entire English line, men who minutes before had been barely holding on, suddenly surged forward, attacking down the hill into the confused French formation. It was a calculated gamble. If the French held together, the English attack could be disastrous, leaving them exposed and disorganized. But the French did not hold together. The combination of the flanking cavalry attack, the sudden English offensive, and the exhaustion and demoralization from watching other French divisions withdraw caused King Jean's division to begin fragmenting. Some units held firm and fought desperately, others broke and fled. The French formation dissolved into confused groups of warriors fighting desperately or running for their lives. The battle transformed from a structured engagement into a chaotic pursuit and massacre. English and Gascon troops pursued fleeing French warriors across the battlefield. Knights who would normally be captured for ransom were killed because the English could not spare men to guard prisoners while the battle continued. The slaughter was terrible. Thousands of French knights fell in the pursuit, cut down from behind as they fled. The field was carpeted with the bodies of French nobility, the armor they had believed would protect them becoming coffins. King Jean II, to his immense credit, did not flee. Surrounded by a handful of loyal knights, he fought on even as his army disintegrated around him. He personally killed or wounded several English warriors, according to sources. His youngest son, Philip, barely 14 years old, stayed at his side, reportedly calling out warnings, "Father, guard yourself to the right. Father, guard yourself to the left," as English and Gascon warriors closed in.
But bravery could not change the tactical reality. The king was surrounded, isolated, and would be killed or captured. A French knight named Denis de Morbecque, who had defected to English service, recognized the king and pushed through the press of warriors to reach him, shouting in French that he should surrender. King Jean, exhausted and seeing no hope of escape, surrendered his gauntlet to Morbecque, the traditional symbol of submission. The King of France was now a prisoner of the English. The psychological impact of the king's capture on the remaining French forces was decisive. When word spread that King Jean had been captured, the last organized French resistance collapsed completely. Nobles who might have fought to rescue their king instead fled to save themselves. The battle was over. The English had won the most complete, most improbable victory of the 100 Years' War. The casualties at Poitiers are difficult to determine precisely, as with all medieval battles, but sources agree they were catastrophic for France. Estimates suggest 2,000 to 3,000 French nobles and knights killed, including some of the most important names in French aristocracy. The Duke of Bourbon was killed, the Count of Ponthieu was killed, the Bishop of Châlons was killed. Dozens of counts, barons, and banneret knights, each representing ancient families and feudal power structures, died on the field. Perhaps more significantly, even more were captured. King Jean II and his youngest son, Philip, were prisoners. Thousands of French nobles were taken prisoner, each one representing a potential ransom payment that would enrich their captors. The ransom for King Jean alone would eventually be set at 3 million gold crowns, an astronomical sum representing several years of France's entire royal revenue. The English casualties were remarkably light. Sources suggest perhaps 100, 200 dead and several hundred wounded, though these numbers may be underestimates. Regardless, the disparity in casualties was staggering. The French lost perhaps 15 times more killed than the English, and the French losses were concentrated among their military and political elite. The immediate aftermath of Poitiers was chaotic and tragic. The battlefield was covered with thousands of dead and wounded. English and Gascon soldiers moved among the fallen, killing wounded French warriors who could not pay ransom, and taking prisoner those whose heraldry indicated wealth and status. It was brutal, but standard practice in medieval warfare. Knights captured prisoners for ransom, which was their primary financial motivation for fighting.
Common soldiers who could not pay ransom were usually killed because keeping them prisoner was not economically worthwhile. The Black Prince conducted himself with considerable chivalry after the battle, treating King Jean with respect and honor appropriate to a captured monarch. That evening, the prince hosted a feast for the captured French nobles, personally serving King Jean at dinner as a gesture of respect. This was theater, political messaging intended to show that the English were not barbaric victors, but honorable knights who had defeated but still respected their noble enemies. It was also pragmatic. Treating high-value prisoners well encouraged them to agree to large ransoms and discouraged desperate escape attempts. The strategic consequences of Poitiers were immense and immediate. France had lost its king, much of its military nobility, and its credibility as a military power. The kingdom descended into political chaos.
The Dauphin Charles, who had retreated from the battle, was now the effective ruler of France with his father in captivity. But he was young, inexperienced, and associated with the defeat at Poitiers. Many French nobles blamed him for the disaster, claiming he had abandoned his father on the battlefield. The Estates General, the French Representative Assembly, met in October 1356 and demanded reforms as the price for funding the kingdom's defense. France was suffering a constitutional crisis on top of a military catastrophe. The peasantry, who bore the cost of constant warfare through taxes and the destruction of raids like the Black Prince's chevauchée, were reaching the breaking point. In 1358, just 2 years after Poitiers, the Jacquerie, a massive peasant rebellion, would erupt across northern France as desperate farmers violently revolted against noble exploitation. The defeat at Poitiers had delegitimized the French nobility's claim to provide protection in exchange for feudal obligations. The English, conversely, were triumphant. The Black Prince returned to Bordeaux with his royal prisoner and thousands of captured nobles. The enormous ransoms would enrich English nobility for a generation. The psychological boost to English morale and prestige was immense. England had proven at Crécy that they could defeat France in battle. Poitiers proved it was not a fluke, but a systematic advantage. English military methods, longbows, dismounted men-at-arms, and aggressive tactical flexibility were superior to French reliance on aristocratic cavalry charges and traditional concepts of chivalric combat. The campaign leading to Poitiers had been a chevauchée, a raid intended primarily for plunder and destruction, not conquest. But the battle's outcome transformed it into one of the most strategically significant campaigns of the war. The capture of King Jean gave England enormous leverage in peace negotiations. The Treaty of Battigny, signed in 1360, gave England huge territorial concessions, full sovereignty over Aquitaine, Gascony, Calais, and other territories, in exchange for Edward III renouncing his claim to the French throne and releasing King Jean. Even after his release, Jean would return to English captivity when his son, left as a hostage, escaped because Jean considered it dishonorable to break the terms of his parole. He would die in English captivity in London in 1364, a tragic end for a brave but unfortunate king. The tactical lessons of Poitiers were studied by military commanders for centuries. The battle demonstrated again, as Crécy had a decade earlier, the devastating effectiveness of English longbows against armored cavalry when deployed in prepared defensive positions. It showed the importance of terrain in medieval warfare, how a smaller force with good positions could defeat a much larger force in open terrain. It demonstrated the critical importance of command and control. The French divisions acting independently without coordination created opportunities the English exploited. It proved that dismounting knights did not solve the tactical problems of attacking prepared positions. It just made the problem worse by slowing the attackers and leaving them under missile fire longer. It showed the psychological dimension of medieval warfare, how the withdrawal of one French division triggered panic and collapse in others, how the sudden appearance of cavalry in the French rear caused disproportionate disruption, how the capture of a king could instantly end a battle.
The question historians have debated for centuries is, why did the French repeat the same mistakes at Poitiers that had led to disaster at Crécy? Both battles featured French forces with overwhelming numerical superiority, attacking prepared English defensive positions and being destroyed by longbow fire and disciplined defensive fighting. Why didn't the French learn? Several factors explain this failure. First, French military culture was deeply invested in concepts of chivalric honor that made tactical adaptation difficult. Knights were supposed to fight bravely, charging the enemy directly. Tactics that seemed cautious or avoiding direct confrontation were considered cowardly, unworthy of nobility. This cultural straitjacket limited tactical options. Second, the French did try to adapt, but they adapted in the wrong direction. They concluded from Crécy that mounted cavalry charges were the problem and decided to fight dismounted at Poitiers. This showed they were thinking about the problem, but their analysis was flawed, focusing on the wrong variable. The problem was attacking prepared defensive positions, not specifically attacking on horseback. Third, the French command structure was dysfunctional. Multiple princes and dukes, each commanding semi-independent divisions without clear overall command, created coordination problems. When things started going wrong, there was no effective mechanism to adapt or recover. Fourth, overconfidence and contempt for the English encouraged risky decisions. The French nobility genuinely believed their superior breeding and training made them better warriors than English archers, whom they dismissed as peasants. This contempt made them underestimate English capabilities and overestimate their own. Fifth, and perhaps most important, the French were trapped by the political necessity of fighting. King Jean could not allow the English to raid across France with impunity. He had to respond, had to bring them to battle, or his authority would be completely undermined. This political pressure forced tactical decisions that military caution might have avoided. The Black Prince's role in the victory deserves careful analysis. He was not a tactical innovator. He was using methods developed by his father's generation at Crécy and other battles. But he was a superb practitioner of those methods, choosing his position well, organizing his forces effectively, positioning his longbowmen to maximize their effectiveness, maintaining his soldiers' morale during the desperate fighting, and most critically, recognizing the moment when he needed to gamble everything on the cavalry flanking attack and general advance. Lesser commanders might have continued fighting defensively, content to survive. The Black Prince recognized the opportunity to turn survival into total victory and seized it. His personal leadership was also crucial. Fighting in the front rank, visible to his men, sharing their danger, he inspired loyalty and courage that held the English line together during the most desperate moments. Medieval soldiers fought for their lord, not for abstract patriotism, and they fought hardest when their lord was fighting beside them. The prince's presence in the front rank was not reckless bravado, but calculated leadership, understanding that his personal example was worth more than tactical direction from safety. The aftermath for the key personalities shows the human dimension of the battle. The Black Prince returned to England a hero, celebrated as the greatest warrior of his generation. But his health had been damaged by years of campaigning in France. He would never fully recover, suffering from what was likely dysentery or another intestinal disease contracted during the chevauchée. Though only 26 at Poitiers, he would be increasingly incapacitated by illness for the rest of his life, dying at 45 in 1376, never becoming king because he predeceased his father.
King Jean II, as mentioned, died in English captivity in 1364, still trying to honor his parole terms. His reputation in France is mixed. Brave but incompetent, honorable but unlucky, a good man who was a poor king. The Dauphin Charles, who would become Charles V, learned from Poitiers and changed French strategy when he became king, avoiding pitched battles with English armies and instead using economic warfare, sieges, and attrition to gradually reconquer French territory. His reign would reverse many of the English gains from Poitiers, showing that strategic patience could overcome tactical defeats. The captured French nobles had varied fates. Those who could pay ransoms were eventually released and returned to France, though often financially ruined by the enormous payments. Those who could not pay remained in captivity for years or died in English prisons. The ransom payments drained French wealth, with estimates suggesting millions of gold crowns flowing from France to England over the following decade. This massive wealth transfer further destabilized France and enriched the English nobility. The Longroman who won the battle at Poitiers became legendary in English culture. The longbow became a symbol of English military superiority and national identity. English kings required regular archery practice by law, ensuring a steady supply of trained archers for future wars. The longbow would remain the dominant weapon in English armies for another century, until gunpowder weapons eventually made it obsolete. But the era of English longbow dominance, symbolized by victories at Crécy and Poitiers, became a golden age in English military memory. The site of the Battle of Poitiers near Noailles-Malpertuis is now peaceful farmland and forest. A monument marks the approximate location where King Jean was captured, erected in the 19th century when Romantic nationalism rediscovered medieval battles. The terrain has changed over 600+ years. Fields have been cleared or reforested, roads have been built, but the basic geography remains recognizable. The hillside where the English deployed is still there. The area where the sunken road funneled French attacks can still be identified. Visitors can walk the battlefield and understand the tactical situation, seeing how the Black Prince used terrain to multiply his smaller forces' effectiveness. The Battle of Poitiers entered literature and legend almost immediately. French chroniclers like Jean Froissart described the battle in detail, though with varying accuracy, and often with conflicting accounts of specific events. English chroniclers celebrated it as a glorious victory, proving English military supremacy. The capture of the French king became one of the most famous episodes in medieval military history, retold in chronicles, poems, and eventually plays and novels. The image of young Prince Philip calling warnings to his father as they fought, surrounded by enemies, became an enduring symbol of loyalty and courage in defeat. Shakespeare would later reference Poitiers in his historical plays, and Victorian painters would create dramatic canvases showing the Black Prince serving dinner to the captured King Jean, emphasizing English chivalry and victory. The battle became part of the founding mythology of English national identity, proof that English yeomen with their bows could defeat French aristocratic pretenses, a democratizing narrative that appealed to later generations.
The military technology at Poitiers deserves detailed examination because it shaped the battle's outcome so decisively. The English longbow was not a particularly sophisticated weapon by modern standards. It was essentially a 6-foot shaft of yew wood with a hemp string, but in trained hands, it was devastatingly effective. Welsh and English archers trained from childhood, with English law requiring regular archery practice. By adulthood, an experienced archer had the strength to draw a bow with 150 to 180 pounds of force and the skill to hit man-sized targets at 200 to 250 yards. The rate of fire was extraordinary, 10 to 15 arrows per minute compared to perhaps 2 to 3 bolts per minute for a crossbow. This meant 3,000 English archers could put 30,000 to 45,000 arrows in the air per minute, creating a literal storm of projectiles. The arrows used bodkin points, narrow armor-piercing heads designed to penetrate mail and find gaps in plate armor. At close range, these could punch through armor entirely. At longer range, they could still wound horses, strike unarmored areas, and create psychological terror. The cumulative effect of thousands of arrows was overwhelming, even when individual shots were not immediately lethal. French armor in 1356 was among the finest in Europe, sophisticated plate armor that covered most of the body. A fully armored French knight was protected from head to toe with articulated plates that allowed movement while providing protection. This armor was expensive. A full suit could cost more than a village produced in a year, but it was effective against swords and most weapons. However, it had vulnerabilities. Joints needed flexibility, so they were protected by mail rather than plate, creating weak points. The visor had eye slits that were vulnerable. The weight, 60 to 70 pounds, made movement exhausting, especially uphill in summer heat. The tactical doctrine behind English success at Poitiers was not secret or particularly innovative. It had been proven at Crécy, Halidon Hill, and other battles. The English would choose a defensive position with good fields of fire for archers, usually on a hill or behind obstacles. They would dismount their men-at-arms to create a solid defensive line. They would position longbowmen where they could shoot at approaching enemies from protected positions. Then they would wait for the enemy to attack, using longbows to disrupt and damage the attack before it reached the English line, then fighting hand-to-hand from a defensive position against enemies exhausted from advancing under fire. It was simple, proven, and devastatingly effective against enemies who insisted on attacking prepared positions. The French knew this English system. They had experienced it at Crécy, but they could not find a way to counter it without violating their cultural values. The effective counter would have been to refuse battle, to shadow the English force without engaging, to use scorched earth tactics to deny them supplies, to harass with light cavalry while avoiding pitched battle, and to eventually force English surrender through attrition. This is essentially what the Dauphin Charles V would do as King Charles V after 1364, and it would work, gradually reconquering most of English territorial gains. But in 1356, such tactics were considered dishonorable, cowardly, unworthy of French knighthood. The nobility demanded battle, and King Jean gave them battle. The result was catastrophe.
The economic impact of Poitiers on both England and France was profound and lasting. For England, the immediate impact was an enormous influx of wealth from ransoms. King Jean's ransom of 3 million gold crowns was only part of it. Thousands of French nobles were captured, each paying ransoms ranging from hundreds to hundreds of thousands of crowns, depending on their rank and wealth. This money flowed into England over the next decade, enriching the crown, the nobility, and anyone who had participated in the campaign. English knights who captured valuable prisoners became wealthy. Common archers received bonuses from plunder. The economic stimulus helped finance further military campaigns and domestic projects. For France, the economic impact was catastrophic. The ransom payments drained the treasury and required extraordinary taxation. The Estates General had to approve new taxes to raise money for the king's ransom, which gave the assembly unprecedented leverage to demand political reforms. The nobility, many of whom were bankrupted by paying their own ransoms, had to sell lands or impose new obligations on their peasants, creating social tension. The destruction from the Black Prince's chevauchée, burning crops and villages across hundreds of miles, created famine and economic disruption that lasted for years. The combination of military defeat, captured king, noble ransoms, and economic destruction created a perfect storm of crisis that nearly destroyed the French monarchy. The political consequences of Poitiers extended far beyond the immediate aftermath. The capture of King Jean created a power vacuum in France that various factions tried to exploit. Etienne Marcel, the provost of merchants in Paris, led a reform movement that briefly took control of Paris and demanded constitutional limitations on royal power. Charles the Bad of Navarre, who had a claim to the French throne, conspired against the Dauphin and tried to use the chaos to advance his position. The Jacquerie Peasant Rebellion in 1358 saw thousands of peasants rise up against nobles they blamed for failing to protect them despite taking feudal obligations. French regional lords began acting independently, effectively treating their territories as autonomous entities while the monarchy was paralyzed. It took years for the Dauphin to reassert royal authority and restore order. The Treaty of Brittany in 1360, negotiated with England, was humiliating for France. England received full sovereignty over approximately one-third of France, including Aquitaine and Gascony. King Edward III renounced his claim to the French throne, but this was cold comfort when England now controlled such vast French territories. The treaty was never fully implemented. Various clauses about territorial transfers were never completed, which meant the war would eventually resume. But for nearly a decade, England appeared to have won the 100 Years' War.
to have achieved through military victory what they had claimed through dynastic right. Poitiers was the high watermark of English success in the medieval phase of the war.
The human cost of Poitiers extended far beyond the casualties on the battlefield. The French nobility suffered a demographic catastrophe. Entire family lines were extinguished, estates left without heirs, political and military leadership decimated. The social structure of feudal France, which depended on noble families passing lands and obligations through generations, was disrupted. Widows and orphans of slain nobles faced uncertainty about inheritance and status. The ransom payments bankrupted families that had been wealthy for generations, forcing them to sell estates to merchants or royal officials, changing the composition of the French elite. The peasants who worked the lands devastated by the Black Prince's chevauchée faced starvation and displacement. Modern estimates suggest the raid destroyed or damaged hundreds of villages and killed or displaced tens of thousands of civilians. This was not collateral damage, but intentional strategy. The chevauchée was designed to destroy French economic capacity and demonstrate royal inability to protect subjects. The psychological trauma on survivors created lasting resentment and contributed to the social upheaval that followed. For the English soldiers who fought at Poitiers, the experience was mixed. Those who survived and captured valuable prisoners became wealthy. Common archers received portions of plunder and bonuses, significant money for men who normally lived as laborers or farmers. But the campaign had been brutal. 2 months of raiding, constant danger, inadequate supplies, disease, exhaustion. Many men died from disease rather than combat. Those who survived often carried injuries or illness home. The Black Prince's own deteriorating health, which would eventually kill him, likely began with diseases contracted during this campaign. The role of Gascon allies at Poitiers deserves recognition. The Captal de Buch, who led the decisive cavalry flank attack, was Gascon, not English. Gascons provided perhaps 1/4 to 1/3 of the Black Prince's army. Gascony was technically part of the English king's domains through complex feudal inheritance, but Gascons were French-speaking and culturally French. Their loyalty to England rather than France was pragmatic, based on commercial ties to English wine trade and fear of French royal centralization. The Gascons fought effectively at Poitiers, and their cavalry charge was tactically decisive, but their presence also illustrates the complex nature of the Hundred Years' War, which was not simply England versus France, but involved civil war dimensions, with French-speaking regions fighting for the English king against the French king. This complexity made the war longer and more destructive than a simple international conflict would have been. The religious dimension of Poitiers is less prominent than in some medieval battles, but it shaped how participants understood the battle's meaning. Both sides believed God determined battle outcomes, that victory proved divine favor. The English victory at Poitiers was interpreted in England as proof that God supported English claims to France, that English righteousness had overcome French wickedness. Te Deums were sung in English churches celebrating the victory as divine intervention. Conversely, French religious thinkers struggled to explain why God had allowed such catastrophe. Some argued it was divine punishment for French sins, that the nobility's pride and corruption had brought divine retribution. Others suggested it was a test of faith, that God allowed suffering to strengthen the faithful.
The chroniclers who recorded Poitiers provide fascinating perspectives on medieval military culture. Jean Froissart, writing in the 1370s and 1380s, described the battle in vivid detail, though he was not present and relied on interviews with participants. His account emphasizes chivalric ideals, individual acts of valor, and the honorable behavior of nobles on both sides. He portrays the battle as a clash of heroic individuals rather than a tactical engagement of military systems. Geoffrey Baker, an English chronicler, emphasizes English superiority and divine favor, presenting Poitiers as proof of English military excellence and God's blessing. French chroniclers struggle to explain the defeat without undermining French honor. often emphasizing individual French heroism while attributing the defeat to bad luck, treachery, or overwhelming English numbers, which was exactly wrong. The English were vastly outnumbered. These differing accounts reveal how medieval people understood warfare through the lens of honor, divine will, and individual heroism, rather than through tactical analysis or systemic factors. Modern military historians analyzing Poitiers focus on tactical, strategic, and logistical factors that medieval chroniclers largely ignored. The battle is studied at military academies as an example of defensive tactics, the effective use of terrain, combined arms coordination between archers and men-at-arms, the importance of maintaining unit cohesion, and the dangers of attacking prepared positions without adequate reconnaissance or tactical planning. It demonstrates that numerical superiority is meaningless if you cannot bring your numbers effectively to bear, that technological advantages, French armor, can be neutralized by proper tactics, English longbows in prepared positions, and that command and control problems, French divisions acting independently, can doom even powerful armies. Comparing Poitiers to other decisive medieval battles reveals common patterns. Like Agincourt in 1415, it featured English longbowmen destroying French cavalry and infantry in prepared defensive positions. Like Crécy in 1346, it showed French nobility's inability to adapt to English tactical invasions. Like Bannockburn in 1314, it demonstrated how smaller forces with good positions could defeat much larger armies. These battles together established a pattern. Medieval warfare was increasingly dominated by missile weapons, longbows, later crossbows and guns, and disciplined infantry, while traditional heavy cavalry was becoming obsolete. The aristocracy resisted this change because it undermined their military and social dominance. If peasants with bows could defeat armored nobles on horses, what justified aristocratic privilege? Battles like Poitiers accelerated the social and military changes that would eventually transform medieval society. The long-term strategic outcome of Poitiers is ironic. The battle was a complete English tactical victory, but ultimately a strategic failure. The territorial gains from the Treaty of Bretigny were gradually lost over the following decades. By 1400, England had lost most of what Poitiers won. By 1453, when the Hundred Years' War finally ended, England retained only Calais in France. The English had won spectacular battles, Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, but lost the war. France had the population, resources, and strategic depth to absorb even catastrophic defeats and eventually prevail through attrition and adaptation. This teaches the historical lesson that tactical excellence without strategic vision achieves only temporary success. The Black Prince won gloriously at Poitiers, but could not convert battlefield victory into lasting political gains.
The Black Prince's reputation suffered in later assessments as historians examined his Spanish campaigns after Poitiers. In 1367, he led an army into Spain to support Pedro the Cruel of Castile, winning the Battle of Nájera, but bankrupting himself with the costs and achieving no lasting benefit. His health deteriorated, and he returned to Gascony increasingly sick. His later governance of Gascony was harsh, imposing heavy taxes that alienated the Gascon nobility who had supported him at Poitiers. By the time he returned to England in 1371, much of his reputation had been tarnished. He died in 1376, predeceasing his father, never becoming king. His son would become Richard II, a weak and ultimately deposed king. The Black Prince's legacy is therefore complex. A brilliant tactical commander who won one of history's great victories at age 26, but whose later career and early death prevented him from achieving lasting strategic success. Poitiers remains his monument, the battle that made his reputation and secured his place in history. The battlefield site today is marked by monuments, but is not heavily visited compared to some more famous battlefields. The area is rural, agricultural, peaceful.
Walking the terrain, you can understand the tactical situation, the hill giving the English a commanding position, the broken ground that would impede cavalry charges, the positions where archers could shoot from cover. But imagining the noise, terror, and carnage of the actual battle requires historical imagination. Thousands of men in armor hacking at each other for hours, the screams of wounded, the smell of blood and sweat, the exhaustion and fear. These visceral realities of medieval combat are difficult to conjure from peaceful farmland. The Battle of Poitiers stands as one of the defining engagements of medieval warfare and one of the most complete victories in military history. A force of 6,000 exhausted, trapped, desperate men defeated an army more than 3 times their size through superior tactics, better use of terrain, more effective weapon systems, and better leadership. The French made a series of catastrophic errors, attacking a prepared defensive position, dismounting their knights, which made them slower and more vulnerable, failing to coordinate their divisions, allowing some divisions to withdraw prematurely, and failing to maintain morale when the battle turned against them. The English exploited every French mistake ruthlessly, using longbows to devastate French attacks before they reached the English line, fighting from prepared positions that maximized their defensive strength, maintaining unit cohesion through excellent leadership, and launching a decisive counterattack at exactly the right moment. The result was not just a victory, but the capture of a king, an event so rare and significant that it transformed the strategic situation of the entire war. The ransoms paid after Poitiers enriched England and impoverished France for a generation. The psychological impact of the defeat nearly destroyed the French monarchy and demonstrated that English military methods were systematically superior to French traditional tactics. Yet ultimately, France would recover, adapt, and prevail. The lessons of Poitiers would eventually be learned. French kings would avoid pitched battles with English armies, using attrition, sieges, and economic warfare to gradually reconquer lost territories. The spectacular English victories proved meaningless in the long term because they could not be converted into lasting conquest of a kingdom with 3 times England's population and resources.
The legacy of Poitiers for military history is the demonstration that tactics matter more than numbers, that defensive positions properly used could multiply a force's effectiveness, that missile weapons operated by trained specialists can dominate traditional heavy cavalry, that command and control problems can doom even powerful armies, and that psychological factors, morale, leadership, unit cohesion, often determine battles more than material factors. The Black Prince's achievement at Poitiers was recognizing all these factors and using them perfectly. He chose his ground wisely, positioned his forces effectively, maintained his soldiers' morale during desperate circumstances, and recognized the moment when defense should transform into offense. He fought personally in the front ranks, inspiring his men through example. He treated his captured enemies with honor after the battle, demonstrating that the English were civilized victors, not barbarians. He achieved at age 26 what few commanders achieve in entire careers: a complete, overwhelming, strategically significant victory against seemingly impossible odds. For these reasons, September 19, 1356, the day 6,000 Englishmen destroyed 20,000 Frenchmen and captured their king, remains one of the most analyzed, celebrated, and instructive battles in military history. The Battle of Poitiers, where the Black Prince won his greatest victory and proved himself one of the finest tactical commanders of the medieval era, stands as a permanent testament to the power of leadership, tactics, and courage to overcome overwhelming odds.